As one gets older, one moves to the end of the working life. This is because it is widely acknowledged that the abilities needed to achieve the employer's goals become harder to achieve with increasing age. The mind may be willing, but the body doesn't always get the memo. And for many criminals, murder is very much an occupation, and it tends to be a younger man's, or indeed woman's, game. So you would imagine at some point, if not incarcerated or executed, the erstwhile bringer of death will hang up their weapon of choice and instead have a hankering for a blanket, a nice cup of cocoa, and maybe an episode of Countdown. But this isn't always the case. We know that leopards tend not to change their spots, and for narcissistic control freaks, sometimes their drive for control and to get their needs met can overcome even the weaknesses we usually associate with advancing age. Today we look at a man who was in his 60s when he eventually qualified as a serial killer with his third murder. In doing so, it once again raised questions about how ex-offenders are supervised in the community. This is the case of Lawrence Bierton, and this is Murder of Crows. To start our sinister tale, we need to travel to Rotherham in the north of England in 1995. Even I was moderately young then, in the process of completing my undergraduate degree. At an unassuming home on Herringthorpe Valley Road in Rotherham, we find sisters Eileen Doodle and Elsie Gregory. Eileen was 79 and Elsie was 73, and they were a support to each other as they were advancing in years. On the 25th of June 1995, they were, as befits anyone of a British persuasion, going to have a nice cup of tea. And they were in the middle of getting their cuppers made when two men arrived at their home. Being polite and decent, the sisters greeted them with tea and cakes and poured milk into china cups that were placed neatly onto a tray. The men, 35-year-old Lawrence Bierton and his accomplice Michael Pluck, had done gardening work for the ladies in the past, But this time they weren't here to weed the borders. They were here to rob the women that these ne'er-do-wells considered easy targets. But when one of the sisters found one of the men stealing from them, things turned ugly and they launched a savage and remorseless attack on the two defenseless women. One of the women was ultimately bludgeoned to death with a hammer-like weapon, while the other was stabbed. Miss Gregory suffered several cuts to her head and fractures to her skull, neck and ribs, consistent with somebody stamping on or kicking her. Miss Doodhill had also suffered a cut to her head, a fractured skull, and bruises to her face and thigh. The two women were then placed beneath a pile of their own belongings and then set on fire as the men attempted to cover their tracks in the blaze. Bierton and Pluck, who lived together at the time, loaded anything of value they could find into a van that was owned by Michael Pluck, and they made their getaway. But despite their efforts to destroy the crime scene, they had left bloodstains throughout the property and fingerprints similarly scattered inside the home. A knife was also found that had traces of blood on it. After the men had been tracked down, it was found that 2 days after the horrific attacks, Bierton went to the Accident and Emergency Department of Bassett Law Hospital with a cut that was seemingly starting to heal, but that had severed tendons at the base of his pinky finger. And this cut was found to be consistent with the blood-stained knife that had been found at the crime scene. The two men were charged with murder, and both were sentenced in 1996 to life in prison. And that should have been the end of a tragic and horrifying story. But it wasn't. Over the years that followed, Michael Pluck continued to protest his innocence and went to great lengths to appeal his sentence. In fact, he twice appealed his conviction. He failed in an appeal in December 2002, and his case was then referred back to the Court of Appeal by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body which investigates suspected miscarriages of justice. While a witness who had condemned Pluck at trial was accused of being a pathological liar, a panel of top judges rejected claims that Pluck was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, and this was at a hearing held in December 2010. On February the 8th, 2011, Pluck's doctor wrote to the parole board requesting his release from prison because he was under the belief that Pluck had less than 3 months to live. Pluck died at HMP Rye Hill on February the 13th, 2012. But throughout all of this time, over 15 years by this point, Lawrence Bierton had made no such declarations of innocence. Lawrence Bierton was released from prison on licence in 2017, but was recalled to prison just a year later for repeated failures to address his behaviour and his ongoing drug and alcohol misuse. Then in May of 2020, after 24 years in prison, he was released on life licence, meaning that he would remain on licence indefinitely following his release. 6 months after his release, the 63-year-old convicted double killer of 2 elderly, vulnerable ladies was inexplicably given accommodation at Rayton Spur, which was a complex for, well, elderly and vulnerable residents. And in this accommodation, he was housed in a bungalow next to 73-year-old Pauline Quinn. Now, the early months of his living at the complex were relatively uneventful, although one event of note was that Bierton, who, as we know, had a history of alcohol misuse, had had an alcohol tag fitted on his release. Alcohol monitoring tags are electronic ankle bracelets that detect alcohol consumption through the skin using transdermal methods. And they monitor individuals convicted of alcohol-related crimes by taking sweat samples every 30 minutes, 24 hours a day. And it was in March of 2021 that Bierton managed to convince authorities to remove his alcohol tag when he complained of swelling in his legs. I wonder what was going to happen when he had that tag removed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Bierton began abusing alcohol again, although no disturbances were noted. But then we get to the 9th of November 2021. Reports suggest that on that day, Bierton was under the influence of drugs and alcohol, with him having drunk vodka and rum, as well as having taken crack cocaine and an opioid on the morning of the murder. And presumably it was this state of mind which led to him leaping over the garden fence that separated his property from Pauline Quinn's and demanding money for alcohol from the disabled pensioner. Now, Pauline Quinn had severe back issues as well as chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, or COPD, which caused breathing difficulties. She needed a walking stick to move around. So as Bierton chased the woman back into her own property, she wasn't able to outrun the desperate man, but she was able to pull her red emergency cord. Once inside the living room at around 4:20 p.m, Bierton launched a savage and sustained attack on Pauline Quinn, where he beat her severely with her own coffee table, hitting her at least 14 times, of which at least 10 were strikes to her head. The reason this can be assessed so accurately is that when Pauline had pulled the red emergency cord, as well as summoning help, it began to record audio from the home. The attack had been recorded. After the killing, Bierton was seen taking his victim's car and visiting a relative before returning to the scene and removing the remnants of the coffee table from Pauline's house in a plastic bag. CCTV showing Bierton walking in the area was evidence that he appeared to be steady, purposeful, sober, calm and collected in the period after the killing. When help arrived for Pauline following her pulling the emergency cord, she was discovered dead in her living room when ambulance staff and firefighters arrived. A post-mortem examination later found that Mrs. Quinn had suffered 29 separate injuries. Bierton was later spotted walking along a road with a plastic bag believed to hold the remnants of the wooden coffee table that had been used as the murder weapon. Pieces of wood from that table were found in a nearby canal. Bierton was circulated as wanted the day after the murder. He was arrested in Sheffield after his family informed the police of his whereabouts. A police search of Bierton in custody uncovered the keys to Mrs. Quinn's back door in his trouser pocket. As the case moved forward towards trial, Anne Barrett from the Crown Prosecution Service, who determine if people should be prosecuted on the weight of evidence, she said, "This was a violent and unprovoked attack on an innocent elderly lady at the hands of her neighbour. She should have been safe in her own home. But Lawrence Bierton beat her to death in her front room." Although Bierton admitted killing Mrs. Quinn, he claimed that his alcohol dependency syndrome meant his ability to make rational judgments or exercise self-control was impaired. The prosecution case was able to show that, on the contrary, he was very much in control and aware of his actions. The jury was shown CCTV footage of Bierton's calm and collected movements in driving away from the scene and disposing of the murder weapon. At the trial, which began at Nottingham Crown Court in December of 2023, witness testimony from a neighbour revealed that Mrs. Quinn had been left feeling intimidated by Bierton, who had appeared on her doorstep asking for money about a month before her death. Bierton's previous convictions for murder were a significant piece of evidence to demonstrate to the jury that this sort of behaviour was not out of character. In order for a jury to consider this sort of evidence that is not directly about a defendant's actions leading to the offence itself, the CPS must make an application to the court, known as a bad character application. This was argued before the trial, and the court felt that it was necessary for the jury to understand the context of Bierton's previous offending. The CPS also made this pattern of behaviour clear to the court, so it could be considered as part of the sentencing process. Bierton had claimed that he had killed Mrs. Quinn because his ability to control his actions was impaired by his dependency on alcohol. But as I said, the prosecution was able to present evidence that clearly showed his calm and calculated actions in driving away from the scene with the stolen keys of Mrs. Quinn's Renault Clio. At the end of the 2-week trial, he was found guilty of murder at Nottingham Crown Court. He had previously pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft in relation to Pauline Quinn's car. On Wednesday the 20th of December 2023, he was given a whole life order, meaning that he will spend the rest of his life in prison.
Triple killer will spend the rest of his life behind bars for murdering his elderly neighbour. He was wrongly housed next to 73-year-old Pauline Quinn while on licence for 2 previous murders. Bierton killed Miss Quinn with her coffee table at her home in Nottinghamshire in November 2021.
Bierton is a violent and dangerous criminal who will quite rightly spend a long time in prison. This was an appalling crime that shocked the local community and devastated Pauline's family and friends. Pauline Quinn was a beloved mother of 3, sister and grandmother whose life was horrifically cut short by this brutal and senseless murder. In what should have been the safety of her own home, she suffered a vicious and sustained attack. Her age and frailty meant she had no chance of defending herself. Speaking on behalf of the family, which is testament to their courage throughout this entire ordeal, they prefer to remember their mother as the happy and caring person that she was. Despite her frailty, she was determined to live life to the full. She always enjoyed spending time with her family and friends. She loved a bungalow and a garden. Driving a car gave her a strong sense of independence. And of course there was Charlie, the dog, who gave her such energy and motivation. As this case finally comes to an end, I would like to pay tribute to Pauline's family, who have shown enormous dignity throughout this entire legal process. We know that no sentence can possibly compensate for the loss of a much loved mother, sister and grandmother. But I do hope that this sentence provides them with some degree of closure. Unfortunately, I'm with them at this difficult time. Thank you.
So quite rightly, this thuggish bastard will serve the rest of his life in prison because his needs will always be more important than anyone else's, to the extreme that he will do anything to make sure that he gets what he wants, regardless who gets hurt in the crossfire. While most people of his age are pondering their favourite kinds of slippers, he was wondering about his next fix and how he was going to get it. To have placed him in an environment where he was surrounded by potential vulnerable victims can only be considered a catastrophic decision. Police raised concerns about his move to the area due to the risk posed to elderly and vulnerable people. But the court heard that this move was approved by the probation service. This decision was described in court by Savagery, head of the Nottinghamshire Probation Delivery Unit, as flawed, no shit, and labelled a significant mistake by the judge, Mr. Justice Pepperell. She added that senior managers would apologise to the family on behalf of the probation service for the serious oversights in the case. Within his sentencing remarks, the judge said that decision, referring to the decision to house Bierton at Ratenspur, was flawed, and you should not have been housed among elderly and vulnerable residents. Ms. Quinn was entitled to expect better, and the system plainly failed her. And I will show the entirety of Mr. Justice Pepperell's sentencing remarks on the screen as we go through the remainder of this case. In a statement released by Pauline Quinn's son Tom Quinn and daughters Janice Quinn and Lisa Rummery, she was described as a beloved mother, sister and grandmother. We, her family, are tortured by the circumstances of her death. In what should have been the safety of her own home, our mother suffered a vicious and sustained attack. One of the hardest aspects of this case has been the fact that the man who killed our mother was a convicted double murderer who had served a life sentence and was on licence. On his release, instead of seeking to make something of his second chance in life, he resorted to killing our mother. It was our mother's terrible misfortune that Bierton was rehoused next door to her. Like his first two victims, she too was a vulnerable elderly woman. And like them, she too was murdered in the most brutal and pitiless way. So there we have the tale of Lawrence Bierton, a total shit biscuit of a man who specifically targeted vulnerable elderly women as easy targets. Having been imprisoned for 2 murders, the experience was clearly not a deterrent, and instead merely delayed his next attack on a vulnerable woman. Despite his claims about substance misuse, he knew exactly what he was doing and showed no restraint in his merciless attacks. He will always be a danger to the public, and he is right where he belongs. The bottom line of the case is that 3 innocent women were killed by a man who just saw them as a means to an end. They were people of value and should have been free to live their lives in the peace that they had become used to. I truly hope that these 3 wonderful ladies are at peace, and that the people who loved them have found ways to manage their pain. This video is, of course, dedicated to them. Thank you for watching another episode of Murder of Crows. I'm Steve, and I'll see you when I see you.
Say that you're ready.